Hey everybody, it's Caitlin. Welcome back to CoronaChat. Today is Thursday, July 30th, and I wanted to talk a little bit about vaccines and kind of give us an update on where we stand with all the different vaccine candidates that are out there right now. We know that experts have said we're going to be dealing with COVID-19 until we get a vaccine and everybody gets vaccinated, but what does it really mean to get to vaccine, right? So let's start with the basics, right? A vaccine is something that we give to our body to, help our immune system understand how a particular pathogen, a virus or bacteria or a parasite works, right, in order to train up our immune system to fight that thing off. And the idea being that you get vaccinated so that when you do get infected by whatever that thing is, whatever that pathogen is, in this case, SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, your body recognizes it, and so it fights it off before the infection gets established and you get sick, right? Vaccines in that sense are kind of a low-risk version of the disease that helps our body learn to create antibodies, right? And there's a number of different ways that vaccines can be constructed, right? So the first way, option one, is by actually using the virus. I'll keep our conversation to viruses now to keep it simple, but is to actually use the virus, right? So in this kind of vaccine, we use either a live, weakened form of the virus or a dead form, and I say dead, in quotes, because viruses technically aren't living or dead, right? But when I say a dead virus, I mean a deactivated version that can't infect you, right? We kind of present that to the body so that your body learns to recognize it and create antibodies and an immune response, right? This method of vaccination, particularly with live weakened virus vaccines, requires a lot of testing to make sure that that live virus is weak enough to not make anybody sick, right? And that it can't mutate back to a more dangerous form. And you might have learned about this whole live versus dead vaccines, dead virus vaccines, if you ever learned about the polio vaccine in school. If this sounds vaguely familiar, maybe you heard about, Salk and Sabin, and one of them had the live vaccine and the other one had the dead vaccine, and there was this whole controversy about whose vaccine was going to be better and who was going to get there first, right? That was that whole kind of, but both of them were working with versions of the actual poliomyelitis virus to create that vaccine, right? And that's the whole virus. So option two for vaccines is what's called a genetic vaccine, right? This is where we take some of the virus's own genetic material and use that to try to create an immune response, right? So the idea is that our bodies learn to recognize either the RNA or DNA of the virus, that genetic information. And so when the viruses infect our cells, right, and start using our cellular machinery to replicate themselves, the body can recognize that genetic information that's being replicated and attack that and kind of cut off replication, right? That's how that would work in theory. Option three is what's called a viral vector, right? A viral vector vaccine is similar to the first one, right, in that we're using an actual virus, but rather than using, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, right, the virus that causes COVID-19, we would take a little piece of that virus, maybe part of that spike protein, for example, and load it into another virus that actually doesn't make us sick, that can infect us but doesn't make us sick, right? And the idea being that, with this viral vector, you're allowing the viral, this weak virus that doesn't cause any problem, to present this information that will teach your immune system to kind of fight it. So this is maybe a good idea if we're dealing with something that we don't really know how to make a weakened form of a virus that isn't going to attack. So we just take a little piece of it off, like the spike protein, and present that instead. And that way we don't have to worry about, oh no, we've infected people with this virus. Could it mutate back to a stronger form, right? Option four is to use the proteins from the virus just by themselves to create an immune response, right? So we've talked about this before in previous videos, but if you look at the image of the coronavirus itself, right, it's like a little round sphere, right, with all those little spikes on it. And those are called spike proteins. And the idea being that, with a protein virus, right, we're just taking that little spike protein and we're just kind of putting that into the body and saying, okay, immune system, use this to figure out how to create an antibody. And so these are all different options, right, of kind of getting the information into the body so that your immune system can recognize it and mount an immune response. There's kind of different reasons why some of these different options might be better or worse than others, right? But there are lots of, when it comes to COVID, there's a number of different vaccines that we've been talking about, right? And they use different versions of these different options, which is why I wanted to kind of give us some grounding on what they were, right? So lots of companies around the world are rushing towards a vaccine, right? This is like the make or break moment for lots and lots of vaccine discovery groups. And so I want to run us through really quickly some of these vaccines, right? So the first is being developed by a company called Moderna. And this is a genetic vaccine, and it's currently in phase 3 of vaccine trials. So, and phase 3 is when phase 1 is like we test to make sure that it's safe, right? Phase 2 is we roll it out with young, healthy volunteers, right? And then phase 3 is we start testing with a broader group of people who, maybe have some underlying health conditions or things like that, to make sure that this vaccine is safe for a wide group of people, right? So one of the things that is important for us to think about in looking at the Moderna trial results, right, is that the participants were not screened for coronavirus before they joined the study. So there's no way to know if the antibodies that they developed were from the vaccine or were because they were infected previously, right? We think they're from the vaccine, we hope they're from the vaccine, but there's no way to make 100% sure. And this is a pretty small study that these results were published from. So again, we're kind of taking these findings with a grain of salt, although, they're promising. Again, we're kind of trying to not get our hopes up too much in case it turns out this doesn't go forward, but the results are promising. I do want to underline that. So the results from the phase 1 of that study have since been published since the last time we talked about the Moderna vaccine, and we'll drop those in the show notes if you're interested in reading them. Now, the second vaccine candidate that you may have heard of is the Oxford vaccine, and this is a viral vector vaccine, right? Now, the Oxford trial did screen out people who could have had antibodies from a previous infection, and it's a much larger study than the Moderna study, so, we're hoping that these results may be a little bit more robust than some of the things that we've seen so far, right? The third vaccine candidate that you may have heard of is something called Novavax, which is one that the U.S. government actually has put a lot of money into funding, right? This is a protein-based vaccine, and the U.S. actually has a very big stake here in terms of supporting the trials and pushing out more doses if it does in fact work, since there's so much money kind of in this. But again, this is kind of a protein-based vaccine. And finally, there's two other options called Sinovac and Sinopharm. These are two Chinese biopharmaceutical companies that are looking at vaccines as well. And these are in the third phase of trials for virus itself vaccines, right? That first option that we talked about, using a weakened form of SARS-CoV-2 virus. So, it's important here when we think about kind of what phase these trials are in, because I know it's easy to say like phase 1, phase 2, phase 2A, phase 2B, like what's going on here, right? But the big thing to think about is that, kind of phase 1 is about safety, phase 2 is about, does this thing work? But again, all of these are going to be kind of small trials. And then phase 3 is where we start to move out to a bigger trial to start testing and saying, does this really work in, in groups of people that start to look more like what the actual population looks like, right? And this move to phase 3 has major implications for worldwide vaccine research, because if a vaccine makes it through phase 3, it means we're confident that it's safe enough and seems to be helpful enough to make it worth giving to lots of people, right? If it passes through phase 3, it can then be approved and given to people to protect them from the virus, right? And then we've actually got a tool in our toolkit in terms of trying to prevent people from getting COVID-19. So in a non-pandemic situation, a vaccine trial usually involves recruiting tons of people and randomizing the trial, so half the people get the vaccine and half the people don't, and then we follow everybody over time to see who gets sick and who develops antibodies. And the question here, of course, is are people in the vaccine group not getting sick because the vaccine protected them, or because they were never exposed to the virus in the first place, right? And it can be kind of tricky sometimes to tell the difference. Now, without an active outbreak of a disease, it can take years for enough people to have potentially been exposed to the virus to know if the vaccine candidate for it works. Now, right now, some people are thinking about, are there ways that we might be able to speed this up, right? Obviously, the fact that we have a huge worldwide pandemic does mean that things are going to move pretty quickly, because we can, we know that people are going to be exposed, right? But some people are thinking, could it be possible to speed that process up a little more if we asked healthy volunteers to be part of something called a human challenge trial, right? Which is when healthy volunteers are given the vaccine and then deliberately infected to see if the vaccine worked. Now, we've used human challenge trials for things in the past, most recently for things like malaria and cholera vaccine candidates. But some ethicists say, like, wait a minute, that's a totally different thing, because we have proven treatments for those illnesses. So if people get sick, we can rescue them, right? We can put them on life-saving treatment and make sure that they don't die. And we don't have that for COVID. So that's a kind of a big ethical question with these human challenge trials. And the other thing, for those of you who may know a little bit more of medical history, right, is that human challenge trials were used more in the past. But a lot of times the people who were quote unquote volunteering didn't seem to have a lot of agency in that choice, right? These were people who, maybe were facing life sentences in prison, or were not in life sentences, but were suggested that maybe they could get their parole review speeded up if they, were willing to submit to a trial. And there's, a pretty dark history around some of these human challenge trials where people really just weren't, given any kind of informed consent or the ability to say no at all. Thinking in particular about things like some of the Nazi experiments that were carried out during the Holocaust, right? There's really real strong ethical problems potentially with human challenge trials. So the World Health Organization and many other medical ethicists are debating whether it's ethical to use a human challenge trial to speed up the vaccine testing process, because with a global pandemic going on and no real treatments, right? Like, well, we can't rescue people if they get sick. But on the other hand, if people are saying, I want to sign up for this thing because I'm terrified, well, is that really a free choice either? There's a lot of kind of heavy kind of ethical questions to wrestle with here. But even while we're still in that process of having that debate, people are actually signing up to participate in a human challenge trial if it were ever to be approved, right? There's a group with about 32,000 people from 140 countries around the world who volunteered to be deliberately infected with coronavirus for the sake of the greater good. So, theoretically, a trial like this could help to speed up the process dramatically and maybe save lives if it looks like some of these candidates really are working. But again, like with so much about the virus, there's still so much that we don't know and won't know until these studies progress further. So I know that was a lot of information, but we're going to drop a couple links in the show notes for additional reading for some of these clinical trials if you're interested. And if you've got other vaccine-related questions, other questions in general about COVID, as always, drop them in the comments. Would love to hear from you. We'll be back next week, and in the meantime, stay safe, take care of each other. Remember, we're all in this together.